Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckey from Democracy Tomorrow. Today we're going to talk to a very good friend of ours who is from one of the most populated countries in the world's largest Muslim country, and a country that you don't hear about all that much given its size, and that country is Indonesia. Indonesia, of course, is located in directly north of Australia and south of Southeast Asia. It's an archipelago comprised of over 18,000 islands. And is a truly extraordinary country in many, many ways. So today we have with us Nanda Yudhaikhwa Pradana from the province of Kalimantan. So welcome, Nanda, to Democracy Tomorrow. How's it going?
Hello, Scott. I'm great. Thank you very much for having me today.
Great to have you here. So maybe just tell listeners quickly about the transition, because this is a show about democracy at the national level, but ultimately it's a show about international democracy and working towards world democracy. But before we get there, countries that are not democratic have to become democratic before they can join the bigger global democracy. And there's no better example of a country that made the transition from pretty solid one man rule dictatorship situation into the democratic situation that you have in Indonesia today. So how just describe briefly how that process went and when it took place and how strong democracy is today.
Yeah, so in Indonesia back then we have regimes, authoritarian regimes. Previously, after we gained our independence in 1945, we have Sukarno. Sukarno is the first Indonesian president who ruled the country, and he had visions to rule the country for his entire life. But in the 1965, Suharto took control over Indonesia from uh, the efforts to maintain the stability of Indonesia after Communist Party attempt to coup Indonesia's government. And after that, Indonesia's been guided by Suharto regime for nearly 32 years. And then in the 1998, 1997, 1998, students and also civil society feel that the Suharto regime went too far because there is a lot of economic pressure, and also there is kind of society one that we need to have a greater chance to be heard by the government. And then at that time, eventually the Suharto regime fell down, and we elect our first president after that in the 1999, and so on and so on and so on. And currently we arrive today in the more better democracy rather than back then.
Right, right. And of course the for viewers that don't know, the colonial power that held Indonesia during the colonial period was the Netherlands, the Dutch. Little old Holland, thousands of kilometers away, controlled this massive archipelago, and was not always very human rights respecting, shall we say. And one of the highlights, or let's say lowlights, of that first period of governance during the Sukarno regime, the first of the two hardliner dictator types, was of course the massacre really of the mid 1960s, when they killed allegedly over 1 million communists in a matter of weeks, I believe, right? It was this attempted uprising which was quashed ruthlessly. And that's what the famous movie The Year of Living Dangerously was made about that period of time. And that must have been terrifying for people to live through that. And but I think what's really interesting to me as an outsider, I've visited Indonesia many times, but not as extensively as I'd like to. But certainly, one of the things that is most striking to me, as a internationally engaged person, was that almost what seemed to be immediate and unexpected transition that took place simply because the dictator died. And this is something that you can apply to dictatorships all across the world. Every dictator dies at some point, and it does almost inevitably fundamentally change the political structure. And one feature that I don't know if it was Sukarno or Suharto who instituted this, but I think you had 25% of all the seats in parliament were allocated to the military.
Yeah, that's we call that dui fungsi ABRI basically. Dui fungsi ABRI means that the armed force have a double roles in society. First, it has a role to secure the nations like all the military across the globe would, and the second, it it has the role to maintain the security of civil society by engage in civil life basically. So basically you have an armored force that have a greater influence in lawmaking and also participations in the civil society.
But that was one of the first things that
Mm.
the new government following Suharto got rid of,
Yeah.
right? So it's now 100% civilian, the
Yep. Mm.
parliament, and it has been since 99, I believe, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So quite a long time. So, that was always a sort of model that people looked to from Myanmar, who were also engaged in their own struggle, because there they have also the same percentage, 25% of the parliament is allocated to military officials. So you can't get legislation through unless you have the support of the military. And I suppose it was the same situation in Indonesia during that period of time. And then 99 came along, Suharto dies. And then not only did democracy come really for the first time in a strong way to the entire nation of, 18,000 islands, but also, of course, one of the less positive points of Indonesia's history, the occupation of East Timor, Timor Leste, that ended also. And that ended also clearly in conjunction with the death of Suharto. So this is another amazing lesson, I think, for people around the world who unfortunately live under dictatorial regimes, is that so much depends on what happens to that one single person, you know? And that one single person has so much power that they can actually continue the occupation of an entire nation, even if they know the people don't want it. And their death leads immediately to the emergence of a new nation exercising self-determination. And so, as you know, I lived and worked in East Timor also. And, it's something happens when a country occupies another country. It really stirs up nationalistic feelings on all sides. And we have the right to be there, and then they say, no, you don't have the right to be there. And in the end, the good thing happened, right? The military left, Indonesia left, they allowed East Timor to have self-determination, and now they exist happily as two equal neighbors to one another. It's a really positive story in the end, even though the occupation period was bad. Um, but now I think the most recent election was within the last year, and it's the fourth major election you've had since the return of democracy to the country. Does democracy feel stable and strong and entrenched now? Can you imagine it ever going backwards? Or how are things nowadays on the democratic front?
Yeah, I engaged in Indonesia's elections last year as one of the, leader of the polling stations, overseas polling stations actually in Melbourne. I feel that in terms of participations, there is, the increased number of Indonesians who are involved and give their votes in Indonesia's elections last year. But in terms of democracy, there is a lot of report and also a civil society organizations that reporting there is a lot of drawbacks, or maybe in there is kind of like Indonesia's democracy is regressed basically in the recent years. Even though previously, before we have current president, we have civilian presidents. I mean, Joko Widodo is one of the Indonesia's presidents who are coming from the civilian backgrounds and democratically elect, but in the in the last years of his administrations, there is a lot of things happen, and one of the things is that the Indonesia's democracy become regress. The pairs and also the medias and something got repressions from the state directly or indirectly. And also in the Prabowo situations, even though Prabowo appear in the media, can handle critics, and also can handle people when trying to talk bad about him in the media. But at the end of the day, if we as Indonesians trying to like say something that really sensitive, there is kind of like repressions indirectly or directly from the government. For example, um, recently there is one of the articles that Indonesian write in a famous newspaper. It's basically criticizing the governments that trying to involve a greater role of military, like what Suharto did, that we have discussed previously. And then the article, become, they delete the article, the media delete the article, and seeing that the writers want all of this by himself. Eventually, we as as Indonesian, know that the writer is being, being being repressed by the government because they criticize government plan to include military again in our, in certain area of the civil government, basically. So yeah, we could say that in terms of participations, there is a greater role of civil society in the elections process. But at the end of the day, democracy is not just about the elections. We need to safeguard every aspect of that, and we see that the democracy itself is being regressed currently. But yeah, we still have hope to recover that conditions, of course.
And
Hmm.
can the president run for re-election, or is it only one term? It's 2 terms, right?
In Indonesia, the presidents the president can run the office for like 2 terms, and
2
each
terms, yeah.
terms they serve for like 5 years.
Right.
Mm.
So 10-year maximum.
Yeah, 10-year maximum.
Right. And do you happen to know like what percentage of the population voted in the most recent election nationally?
I think it's more than 50%. I quite forget what's the numbers here, but I think
Mhm.
it's more than 50% of the populations. Yeah, it's more than
And
50%. I think it's more than 60. Yeah.
so you don't have compulsory voting like in Australia.
No, we don't have
Right.
compulsory voting, so basically we can actually criticize the election system by casting you know uh votes that being canceled or something, and then you can not going to the elections process as the critics to the election system.
And um, in terms of Australia, the we had recent elections like a month ago or so, a few weeks ago. Landslide victory for the Labor Party, so they've just started their second term this cycle. And the very first thing that the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese did in terms of foreign visits was to visit Indonesia. And I don't know if this is the first time that's happened after a new government has come in, but I think it was incredibly significant that instead of going to the traditional place, which is New Zealand, or maybe England, some country that's got historical links uh, to the Western world side of Australia. He went to Indonesia and brought officials with him and met with the president and a lot of others in the country. And I hope that that is a first step towards an ever greater embrace of Asia generally and Indonesia specifically by Australia, because Australia is always walking this fine line between being Asian and or being Western, you know? And clearly, in my view, you can be both simultaneously. But for the longest period of time, of course, Australia during the early years was very fearful of Asia, right? They had official policies that were not embracing at all. And so when you look at it in a historical perspective, it's really significant that he did go there first. And it's important for people to remember Indonesia has 280 million people. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population. It goes India, China, United States, Indonesia. So it's not an insignificant country. It has a huge economy, growing economy, and it's the headquarters of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. A lot of things it's of course the place where Bali is, which a lot of people, that's probably the thing that most people know about, but it's also the country where the famous non-aligned movement started, the Bandung Charter back in the 50s. And so it's an incredibly important and centrally located country. Um, that's far more significant than most people think it is. Another thing about Indonesia that people should know is that it's really very much on the front lines of climate change. And with 18,000 islands, you can imagine that a lot of those islands are under threat. But it's not just the islands, it's the capital itself, Jakarta. So maybe you can tell listeners about this whole process of moving the capital and how that's going.
Yeah, basically, Jakarta is sinking, and the Indonesia's government trying to, move the capital from the Java to the Kalimantan, to the Borneo Island, basically. But it's not just about the climate change, it's also about the nation's visions back then. So our founding fathers, basically, back then, have a visions that Indonesia's capital must not in the Jakarta, in Java, but it need to be in the central of the nations. I mean, when we say the central, it means geographically it's in the central of our nations. So the place that our new capital is situated at right now is in the heart of our nations. Basically, if you look at the in a map in Google Earth or something. So basically, it's also the visions of our founding fathers is that Indonesia must not be, it's not Java centric. We need to kind of like redistribute the development to the other part of our island, so the governments have a greater reach and grasp to induce development in the other part of our nation. So yeah, climate change is a current situations that we as Indonesians cannot deny, especially who living in Jakarta. They have kind of like a giant seawall to protect from the rising sea level, and also they struggle to always to trying to be more responsible in using the water or something, especially from the ground, or that recently making the ground become more sinking and something. And the pollutions also happen in Jakarta. So yeah, they're trying to move to Kalimantan and kind of like create a new capital there based on uh, green technology, and the special planning or something. And basically we kind of like see Canberra as our role model. There is a lot of political analysts that say that uh, Canberra in Australia is the how Indonesia's government visions of the new capital uh, should be in the future. So yeah, that's all about. I think
And
that's
it's called Nusantara, right?
yeah, we call it Nusantara. So basically, Nusantara is how Indonesian back then addressed the archipelago. So before the Indonesia even exists, we believe in the Nusantara concept. So, but Nusantara itself is a more historical perspective, because it not only saying about the territorial reach or territorial situations that we currently govern as Indonesian states, but also envisions a lot of extraterritorial or something territory that now currently it's not part of Indonesia basically. But it's also the representations of the unity of Indonesian people because um, beside we construct our identity based on the colonial history, we also trying to create and embrace national identity as a people who live in this archipelago, the Nusantara. So by naming a new capital as Nusantara, it's kind of like create an emphasis that this is for the people of Nusantara, for the Indonesian archipelago. This is the representations of unity. It's not just about climate change. It not just about the founding's father visions, but it's also about our national relationships as a multinational state and country.
And you have this this sort of national ideology called Pancasila, right?
Yeah,
Is that
Pancasila.
still
Yeah.
Pancasila? Is that still in existence now, or is that only associated with previous regimes? That's part of the nation, isn't it?
Yeah, Pancasila. We need to recite Pancasila every every back then when I was in junior high school, when I was in the elementary school, junior high school, senior high school, we need to recite Pancasila at least once a week. So
Oh,
basically,
really?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, because
Uh-huh.
it is part of kind of like our ideology to to live as Indonesians basically. And even though there is a lot of critics that say that, oh my god, Pancasila isn't relevant today because there is a lot of social welfare that the Pancasila promises as an ideology is not delivered to the people. But at the end of the day, uh, one part of the text that unite us as a nation is the ideology itself.
And so, what does it actually mean to an ordinary Indonesian? What does Pancasila mean?
Pancasila basically is the five guiding principles of how Indonesians live. For example, we need to kind of like uh, recognize the existence of God, and we need to live in accordance to God's law. Of course, the God itself is whatever gods that you believe, but you need to at least recognize that there is some kind of greater existence that rule the universe. So yeah, that's the first things about Pancasila. And the second is we call it kemanusiaan yang adil dan beradab, means that we recognize that every human is equal and we treat them as human treat humans. We never kind of like treat people differently. And yeah, that's two of the five things of Pancasila basically. So yeah, we need to embrace the belief of of God, and then we need to kind of like have a good humanity, a sense of humanity. And Pancasila also stipulate that we need to maintain our unity as Indonesian people. So basically, we put our national unity as an important matter. So uh, you need to bring your individual goals aside to kind of like maintain the national unity. So if your individual goals could make the Indonesia's collective objective being, we cannot achieve the collective goals, you need to step aside for your individual's goals. And then, of course, Pancasila also stipulate about the democracy, means that we basically want to be ruled by wisdom, the leader that have wisdom. And of course, the last things about Pancasila is uh, keadilan sosial, basically social justice and welfare.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And everybody in Indonesia would know. what Pancasila is, right? Like if you
Yeah,
ask anybody on the street, can you explain it to me? They would know what to say.
yeah, but it is quite funny that we have TikTok, and then we look at the interview, street interview to the young Indonesians, basically. And there is a lot of video that's the interviewers want the people who they met in the street to recite Pancasila, but they don't know what it is. So basically, it is sometime uh, Pancasila is treated is we treat Pancasila is like it's like we treat a lot of holy scripture in Indonesia. Basically, we can recite them, but we don't understand what it means. There is a phenomenon in Indonesia where we can recite Al Quran, but we don't understand what the translations of the Al Quran itself. So there is two common phenomenon. We cannot recite it. We don't know what the text is, what the texts are. But there is also second phenomena. We can when while we can recite that, we can give you the text. We can kind of like recite it to you, but we don't understand what it the means of that.
Yeah, right, right. I think that's a phenomenon that is global. A lot of people, if you ask them on the street, what is, the Constitution say in your country, most people wouldn't know what to say. Even the national song, describe the national song, try to sing me the national song, they couldn't do it, So, but just back to the whole question of the creation of Nusantara and all of that. So, a lot of countries in the world have created new capital cities. So doing that is not all that unusual. I mean, you mentioned Canberra in Australia. That was built out of nothing in the middle of nowhere to take sort of power away from the power centers, which were in Australia's case, Melbourne and Sydney. And it sort of prevented a rivalry between those two cities, and it allowed the political structures to exist in a third place. They did it in Nigeria with Abuja. They did it in Tanzania with Arusha. Even the generals in Burma did it with Naypyidaw, and the United States did it with Washington D.C. Centuries ago. So doing that is not that outlandish or unusual at all. In fact, it's quite common. But in this case, you said, and rightfully so, it's a historical idea. It didn't just happen overnight, and the cost involved is huge. I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Um, I believe much of the transfer of the infrastructure and the various buildings that are going up in Nusantara is paid for by non-Indonesian sources, particularly Middle Eastern sources. So there's all those kind of issues involved, and there's some environmental issues and so on. But as we talked about very briefly, the bottom line is the biggest city in Indonesia, which is how big is Jakarta now? 12 million, 15 million? I mean, who knows?
I think it's 10.67 millions populations, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the official number, and then
Yeah.
probably the unofficial number is probably much bigger.
Yeah, probably
But
much bigger because we
yeah,
also have undocumented residents there.
yeah, no doubt. And then a big chunk of the land of Jakarta, as you mentioned, is actually sinking. And this is also something that's common now, particularly in Asian cities, more than any other region. Parts of Tokyo were sinking, parts of Bangkok are sinking, big parts of Jakarta are sinking. Some Chinese cities are sinking. I mean, this is a regional problem that's much bigger than people realize, and most of that comes from overuse of the groundwater, right? Because most cities sit on groundwater, and when you have that much population needing water, combined with the amount of weight that all that concrete holds in building those new buildings and everything, that's pushing down. Sea levels are rising, and you're depleting the groundwater at the same time. And so you get sinking cities, which are resulting in significant numbers of people having to move, and they're losing their homes, they're losing property values, they're losing all sorts of stuff, perpetual flooding in neighborhoods that didn't used to flood. So Jakarta is one of the major cities where that's happening, and so it faces tremendous difficulties. And it's obviously a very advanced city and it's very developed and all of that, but there are huge swathes of the city which are basically slums, as they are in many other Asian cities, many African cities, Latin American cities, increasingly Western cities. Um, and it's very often those neighborhoods that are the most heavily affected. So even though, you know, it's often sold like publicly in the international level, you hear about, Jakarta is moving because of climate change. And that's only partially true because most of the people that are moving to Nusantara are not the slum dwellers. The ones that need to move, it's actually civil servants, military, large corporations, government bodies, and things of that nature. So it's a fluid sort of complex process. But maybe talk some more about um, just the strength. I think the strength of democracy today in Indonesia and what people are doing nationally and locally to make democracy stronger because as you alluded to, Indonesia, had it not been colonized by the Dutch, would have probably been many different countries. And it was that colonial process. Same with India. If India hadn't been colonized by the United Kingdom, today it would probably be a whole series of different countries. And so the legacy of that colonialism continues to exist in the form of the borders that the colonizers essentially created and creating this sort of artificial sense of unity. And then of course every government wants to hold together what it has, right? Like it's a built-in thing, particularly in military officials, do not allow the country to break apart. It's the overarching goal of every general in the world. Do not let my country fall apart. Even if it should fall apart, don't let it fall apart. And so in Indonesia, even though it's largely a Muslim country, for instance, that's one of the things that holds it together. There are a lot of cultural and other differences in different parts of the country. And as you mentioned, the island of Java is pretty much the most crowded island in the world. It's a super high population density, and it has a disproportionate amount of power vis-a-vis the other parts of Indonesia, as is the case in many countries. Even in tiny Pacific Island countries, and even in Tuvalu, which only has a population of 12,000 people, 15,000 people, maybe 20,000. It's very small. Um, it's comprised of basically 9 islands, right? And one of those islands, I won't mention which one, but one of those islands has totally disproportionate power vis-a-vis all the other ones. So there's a little like there's tension, minor, but still, it's the same in Solomon Islands, same in all sorts of different it's particularly countries comprised of islands, like in Indonesia, where you have these different practices and that like and Islam has such a broad level of you have really hardcore guys, you have really moderate guys, you have everything in between. And some are really fundamentalist about their beliefs, others are very flexible. And you have all of that, right, in Indonesia. So just yeah, maybe just a few final words about the strength of democracy, where you think things are going, and what could people do to entrench democracy more deeply and ensure that everybody in Indonesia gets what the human rights treaties of the world promise them, which is all those freedoms, all those rights, decent standard of living, all those sort of things.
Indonesia's democracy are regressed, like I said previously. But at the end of the day, the civil society become more aware that we cannot allow that happen. Choosing military background leaders is not just about we as a civil society will see a lot of military leaders will coming back to the office because this is what it is what it is. Prabowo said that I run out of money because I'm not run the office because I'm not being elected in the previous elections. He said that, my God, I'm run out of money because I'm not being in power for years. So this is clearly intentions of certain people who trying to exploit the unawareness of people about our current political situations and political system. But at the end of the day, I think democracy will prevail in Indonesia because we become more aware that choosing seemingly good guys, it's not necessary that the situations will improve.
Right. And so you obviously don't have a legal rule that says former military officials cannot run for higher office.
No, we don't have that. But it is, after Suharto regime, there is kind of like consensus among Indonesian people that we need to be careful when choosing military background leaders. But we also have military background leaders back then. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, our president after Megawati, before Joko Widodo, he's also have military backgrounds. But at the end of the day, SBY, we call it SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, we call it SBY. But at the end of the day, this president is reformist, they have UKP for the presidential assistant forums that led people to preserve their forests, internalize a lot of international norms. At least this kind of presidents uh, put their best men, put their best and intellectual men to help him to run the country. I'm not SBA supporters, but I need to accept the fact that during SBA leaderships, there is a lot of reforms that we achieve. For example, the rupiah becomes strong again, even though that time we have financial crisis in 2008. If I'm correctly recall, but he can manage the situations well back then. And also we internalize a lot of international norms to our industry. For example, in the palm oil industry, we create our sustainability standards in order to internalizing international norms, in order to prevent forest loss, in order to make the cultivations of palm oil become more become more human rights, more adhere to human rights values, and also redistribute the wealth not only among oligarch or people who run the office, but also for the people. But yeah, that's you know that's the thing. It's not just about the military leader or military background itself, but also how they have the efficiency.
What would you consider the biggest two or three problems facing Indonesia today, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, we have unemployment rate that increasing. Our current administrations during elections promises that they will open 19 million of job, but the statistic say differently. Even though we have populations demographic bonuses that increase, we have a lot of productive populations that increasing every year, but the level of job available is decreasing. So basically, we 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 put the bonus coupon from the supermarket to the trash can. Basically, we have a lot of productive of labor forces, but at the end of the day, the government cannot open formal jobs, and they push us to informal jobs like SMEs or something. Uh, I don't say that if you have a retail or something is bad, but at the end of the day, if we zoom out and see in the broader picture, having a lot of small and medium enterprises in your country, it signals that government cannot ensure that they can create a formal job or something to in your country. That's why they need you to rely on yourself. And the second thing is about the climate change in general, but a lot of Indonesians now concerns about how good current Indonesian government in prevent the forest loss and biodiversity loss, because we have NDC, National Determined Commitment, and also we have volume net sinks. Volume net sinks is basically our objective to reduce deforestations in 2030. So basically, Indonesia's government set 10, um, 10 million hectares that can be deforested in 2030. Half of it is plant deforestation, and half of it is unplanned deforestations. But currently, we just use the quota. We just ran out of the quota that we set up previously, and also, uh, because the electronic vehicle markets are increasing globally, we trying to fulfill the nickel to supply for the electronic vehicle battery, and the extractions of that resources is pretty bad. One of the research that I read, that give me insights why Indonesian's government doesn't want to increase sustainability in the nickel sector is that our dependency towards one country, a country, basically, because our nickel supply chain is dominated by a country. uh, and this country doesn't provide any incentive to reform sustainability performance in our nickel extractions, and that's bad for climate change, because there is ongoing coastal communities that not only they being displaced by the climate change, but they being displaced because their environment is getting worse. For example, the water is polluted or something. And the third problems that we Indonesians considers broadly is about, um, I think it is about, the democracy itself, that, what we talk, the poverty and something. So basically, on the poverty, there is some kind of report that the poverty rate in Indonesia is increased and it's very high, but our government trying to manipulate in positive or in negative way the variables to measure the poverty. So it appears that our poverty is, kind of like uh, prog- not progressing in a good way, but kind of like decrease basically. But independent researchers show that's it's not the case basically. So yeah, we care a lot about social and environmental and also economic issues basically. Are more Indonesians aware because it's also because the government sent us to study overseas. So basically we exposed to good education system, and then a lot of people uh, not only equip themselves with literacy, standard-based literacy, but they also trying to critically criticize the government, basically. And we found that in certain area of life, the situation is getting worse, but we have optimisms to, to solve that problems, basically.
Right. And are there many migrants that come and live in Indonesia from other countries?
We have a lot of migrants. For example, in certain areas of Indonesia, we have mainland China's migrants, particularly for working in certain strategic projects, like in nickel extractions. And there is a lot of verifiable report that a lot of mining corporations that extract nickel in Indonesia, they employ a lot of Chinese citizens there. I mean, mainland China, not China's descent with Indonesian nationality, of course, but from China mainland. And also, we also, have refugee communities from Middle East and also from, from Myanmar or something. But it is particularly situated in Sumatra, yeah, northern Sumatra, and it's not in Jakarta. So yeah, we are pretty, especially when you talk about Bali, there is a lot of migrant, of course, particularly from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, another thing that we didn't talk about at all that's really important in the history of Indonesia was how badly affected you were by the tsunami. Um, in 2004, right? I mean, Aceh in particular, at the tip of Sumatra, got just devastated. I mean, it was the hardest hit area in the entire region was Aceh, where I mean the entire main city there was just flattened in a matter of minutes. Another big challenge to overcome. So, well, thank you very much, Nanda. Like, it's always interesting talking to you about Indonesia and the challenges that it faces. And, I would not envy any politician in any country, but a country with that much poverty and spread out across so many islands with such a challenging history. Um, it would be a hard job. It would be a really hard job when your capital is sinking, etc. So, let's hope that that spirit of democracy that came so suddenly in 1998, 1999, that people don't forget how precious it is and how important it is and how much it can help to improve the standard of living of ordinary people across the country. People often, people who live in democratic countries, even newly democratic ones like Indonesia, they very quickly take it for granted and forget just how important it is. And you made the point several times very correctly that democracy is not about voting. Voting is one of thousands of elements of what a true democracy is. Democracy means the rule of law, it means equality, it means access to justice, it means everybody has a job, it means that wealth is distributed freely, it means there's a functioning taxation system, it means there's good infrastructure, that people don't get sick because they're drinking the water, that there's measures taken in the health sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what democracy, ultimately means. So hopefully things will continue to improve, and Indonesia, like all countries, can blossom into the country that it has the potential to be, you know? And, I've met thousands of Indonesians in my life, probably tens of thousands, and I still haven't met a really horrible one. So that's a pretty good sign for the country, that people are genuinely very open and very friendly and very that spirit of equality that you mentioned, that's very real. There's a sense of trust and care for others, a sort of welcoming of the stranger, being hospitable, that's very much a part of the Indonesian spirit. So, that's something that the rest of the world can really learn from too. So, any final words, Nanda, today that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I think the final words for today's sessions is like, yeah, as Indonesians, we always trying to, kind of like make it true that someday we will have, uh, democracy standards like a lot of, uh, Western countries have. Like, we have a greater say as a populations in our governments. And believe or not, by creating a network of or alliance with global citizens across the globe, we have the power and we can empower the movement to uh, you know to have more accountable government, basically, that serve to the people, not only serve the particular interests that that trying to uh, make themselves wealthier while undermine other people access towards better life, basically. So yeah, I think that's my final words for today.
Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned, being a global citizen or a world citizen, because really, at the end of the day, what it means is that you don't just care about people in your own village or your own family or your own street. You care about people on the other side of your country, but you also care about people in the rest of your region and then the rest of your planet. And if you can help them, hopefully they can also help you. And I should just mention, one of the initiatives that Democracy Tomorrow is undertaking in the coming months is we're coming up with like a generic resolution that every single local government in the world could adopt if they want to, which will indicate their commitment to pursuing the idea of world citizenship in concrete ways. And one of the concrete ways would be finding legal mechanisms within the legal system of the country in which the city exists, which signs this resolution, to confer official legal world citizenship status on people who want it, right? Voluntary opt-in system, not automatic, but if you want it, they will confer it upon you. And then they will also agree, if they agree to this resolution in its current form. We haven't released it yet. We're still negotiating it with many different people. But it will also include the duty, if you sign it, to recognize the world citizenship status of any person in any other city who has also signed the resolution. So if somebody, if a neighborhood of Melbourne, let's say a suburb like Brunswick, the local council there, it's called Marybeck Council. If Marybeck Council adopted this resolution, they would commit not only to develop some sort of mechanism that would confer world citizenship status on top of the Australian status that they already have, but then Jakarta also ratified the same resolution. That local government, Mary here, would commit itself to recognizing the world citizenship status of anybody in Jakarta who also got their own version of that status conferred upon them. So, in other words, they may be able to travel not just as an Indonesian citizen, but also as a world citizen, and so on and so forth. So, our goal in the end, I mean, the dream is every local government in the entire world adopts this same resolution and then begins the process of slowly, gradually embracing and being more concrete about the idea of world citizenship, because it's not just a dream, it's not just an impossible future scenario. We need to make it real, and to make it real, it means real institutions have to adopt real rules about it, and real people have to benefit from it ultimately. So, it should be Australia, because we're so close to you, in Indonesia. We should pay much more attention to, let's say, poverty in Indonesia, and do whatever we can from the Australian side to alleviate the poverty and to reduce the deforestation and to make the water supply better and all of those things. Not everything, but there's certain things you can do to make it easier for Indonesia to fulfill its commitments. And that's just one of trillions of things we can imagine doing. But in that same vein, world citizenship basically means you care about everybody everywhere. And if more of us did that in our own ways, saw ourselves as more similar than more different, I think we'd be in a much better position. So, Nanda, thank you very much for talking to us today at Democracy Tomorrow. That's our discussion for today about the fourth biggest country in the world, Indonesia. And we will be back tomorrow with the next episode of Democracy Tomorrow. In the meantime, please subscribe, please tell your friends, please like. Thanks for watching, and good night.